Okay, so, like, let's be real for a sec. Out there in the world, everyone's got an opinion on, like, everything. But how do we move beyond just those, like, those surface level hot takes? You know what I mean? How do you craft opinions that are really informed and, actually make people think? That's what we're going to, like, deep dive into today. We're really going to explore how to, like, take your opinions from just, like, reacting to stuff to really, like, reflecting and thinking it through, especially when it comes to all those crazy current events. Things are always changing so fast.
Yeah, and what I think is super interesting is we're not just trying to, like, win arguments here. Yeah. This deep dive is all about giving you the tools to understand those complex issues. Yeah. So you can, like, come to your own conclusions. Conclusions that are actually based on evidence, and then, like, be able to explain what you think in a way that makes for, like, actual good conversation.
Right, because it's not about being right. It's about being, like a good citizen, like someone who actually thinks about things, a good employee even, just like a more informed person.
Exactly. And the source we're looking at today, expressing informed opinions on current events, it really, like, nails that. It highlights how developing this skill, it can actually help you in so many parts of your life, from work to relationships and everything.
Okay, that's cool, but honestly, sometimes it feels like I'm, like, drowning in information. Like, where do I even start?
Yeah, that's a really common challenge. And the source, like, it tackles that head on. One of the first things it suggests is diversifying those news sources, Think beyond just your usual go-to places. Explore some international perspectives, like Al Jazeera for a Middle Eastern viewpoint, or The Guardian for UK take on things. It's amazing how just seeing things through different lenses can challenge those assumptions you have and, give you a much more well-rounded understanding of what's going on.
That's such a good point. So easy to get stuck in that echo chamber, especially online. But, okay, how do I know if these news sources are even credible? I don't want to be falling for, like, misinformation or something.
Right, and that's where those critical thinking skills are super important. The source really emphasizes analyzing sources for potential bias. You got to look at who's funding the publication, their editorial stance, like, what's their track record?
So it's not just about reading more, it's about reading smarter too.
Right? Absolutely. The source also recommends using those fact-checking websites, like snopesfactcheck.org. Let's say you see some crazy claim about election interference on social media. Instead of just, like, believing it, you can plug in those keywords to a fact-checking site and see if there's any actual proof. That's how you arm yourself against all that misinformation out there.
I love that those tools are like a safety net, with all this information overload. And then maybe this is getting a little philosophical, but isn't there more to forming an opinion than just the facts?
You're hitting on something really crucial there. The source reminds us that our personal values and experiences, they play a huge part in shaping how we see things. You could read 2 different articles about, like, some new economic policy and come away with totally different opinions, just based on your own background and beliefs.
I see what you mean. So it's about recognizing that our own values are always, like, part of the equation.
Yeah.
Even when we're dealing with stuff that seems objective.
Exactly. And once you have a good grasp of your own values, the source encourages us to go further and back up those opinions with, like, solid research. Let's say you're super passionate about climate change. You want to, like, advocate for renewable energy. Don't just rely on arguments that are, like, all emotional. Dig into the data. Look at reports from those reputable organizations like the International Energy Agency or the IPCC.
So it's like you're combining those passionate beliefs with real evidence to, like, make a stronger case.
Precisely. And that brings us to the next stage, communication. How do we actually explain these well-researched, value-informed opinions in a way that people get?
All right, let's talk communication. The source really emphasizes, like, clarity and structure.
Right, right. It has this great analogy. A well-structured argument, it's like a roadmap for your listener. It guides them through your points logically. Imagine you're trying to convince your friends to support some local environmental thing. If you just, like, throw a bunch of random ideas and statistics at them, they're going to tune out.
They'd be so lost. I know I would.
Exactly. But if you present your argument with, like, a clear intro, you outline your main points, you have supporting evidence and a good conclusion, you'll have a much better chance of actually getting your message across.
Okay, so structure is key, but what about tone? I know I can get pretty heated about certain things.
I hear you. And the source actually talks about that directly. It emphasizes how important a neutral tone is, so you don't alienate your audience. And you keep the conversation respectful. Let's say you're discussing some controversial political issue on social media. It's tempting to just fire back with sarcasm or insults, but that rarely actually leads to anything productive.
So even if I strongly disagree with someone, I should try to stay calm and present my points in a reasoned way.
Exactly. And the source also highlights active listening. Instead of just waiting for your turn to talk, try to actually understand the other person's perspective. Ask questions, acknowledge their points, look for common ground.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But honestly, sometimes it feels like some people just want to disagree no matter what. Like no amount of evidence will change their mind.
That's true. And the source acknowledges that, not every conversation is going to be easy. But it does give us some strategies for those disagreements and even controversies.
Like what? I'm all ears.
So one of the most valuable things the source says is you got to acknowledge valid points from the other side, even if you totally disagree with their overall stance, Let's say you're talking about healthcare reform and someone brings up concerns about wait times increasing. Instead of just dismissing them right off the bat, you can acknowledge it. Say something like, yeah, that's a good point, and it's definitely important to think about how this could affect wait times. However, studies have also shown that, you know?
So it's like finding that common ground, even if it's just a little bit, to have a more productive conversation.
Exactly. It shows you're actually listening and taking their concerns seriously, which can really help de-escalate things and make the conversation better, And instead of getting stuck in all that emotional stuff, the source says we should focus on the data and evidence.
I like that. Sticking to the facts.
Absolutely. And speaking of facts, the source reminds us that expressing informed opinions, it's not just about theories. It's about using these principles in real life.
Okay, so let's get practical. Give me an example. How does this all come together in a real situation?
Let's say there's this new government policy. That would have a big impact on the automotive industry. Stricter emission standards for new cars, You want to form an informed opinion about it, maybe even participate in the conversation around it. Where would you start?
Well, based on what we've talked about, first, I'd gather info from a bunch of different sources. I wouldn't just rely on my usual news app or social media. I'd look for reports from those reliable organizations, like the EPA or the NHTSA. I'd try to find analyses from industry experts. And maybe even read some opinions from both sides,
That's a great approach. By diversifying your sources, you get a much more complete picture. And remember, it's not just about how much info you get, but the quality of that info. You got to evaluate each source for credibility and potential biases.
Right, like we talked about. Checking for things like funding sources and editorial stances helps us decide how much weight to give each piece of information.
Exactly. Once you've gathered enough info, the next step is to analyze what you've learned. What are the goals of the policy? How would they actually implement it? What are the potential impacts, on the economy, the environment, and importantly, how do you feel about those impacts?
This is where those personal values come in. I might be all for reducing emissions, but also be worried about the economic burden on certain communities or industries.
Exactly. Recognizing those nuances is super important to forming a well-rounded opinion. As you're going through the info, it's helpful to write down your thoughts, highlight key points, maybe even make a pros and cons list. Getting those thoughts out of your head and onto paper can really help you clarify your own perspective.
So we've done our research, analyzed the issue, and figured out our own stance. What's next?
Now it's time to think about communication. How can you explain your opinion clearly, concisely, and in a way that'll resonate with people? The source really stresses how important it is to structure your argument effectively. Think of it like building a house. You need a solid foundation, strong supporting beams, and a good roof.
Okay, I like that analogy. So how do we build that argument house?
The source says to start with a clear introduction. Briefly state your overall opinion on the policy and the main points you're going to talk about. Then, in the body of your argument, you present your evidence in a logical order. This might involve using statistics, referencing experts, or even sharing personal stories that illustrate your points. Finally, you wrap it up with a conclusion that sums up your main arguments and restates your stance.
Sounds like we're writing a persuasive essay. Hopefully a bit more interesting than the ones I did in school.
Hopefully much more engaging. Remember, you want to present your argument in a way that connects with your audience.
So how do we figure out the best way to present it? Do we write a blog post, make a video, start a Twitter thread?
Choosing the right platform is key. The source tells us to think about our audience and how to reach them best. If you're passionate about this emissions policy and want to influence lawmakers, writing a letter to your representative or going to a town hall meeting might be most effective. If you want to have a broader conversation, a well-researched blog post or a LinkedIn article could be good.
I see how all these pieces fit together. diversifying sources, analyzing info through our values, crafting a good argument, and then choosing the right platform.
You got it.
Yes.
But it doesn't stop there. The source reminds us that expressing informed opinions, it's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process.
So what happens after we put our opinion out there? Just sit back and wait for applause?
Not at all. Expressing your opinion is just the start of the conversation. Then you engage with people, respond to comments, answer questions thoughtfully, and be open to feedback.
Even if the feedback is negative.
Especially if it's critical. Remember, the goal isn't to win every argument. It's to have a meaningful discussion and keep learning and refining our perspectives.
I appreciate that reminder. It's easy to get defensive when someone criticizes our views. But I see how those critiques can actually help us grow.
Exactly. Now, even though this process might sound pretty straightforward, the source says there are some real challenges to expressing informed opinions these days.
Okay, let's talk challenges. We mentioned information overload, but what are some other obstacles?
One of the biggest is navigating all the misinformation out there. With so much content online, it can be really hard to tell what's credible and what's just fake or misleading.
Yeah, it feels like every time I open social media, there's a new conspiracy theory or some crazy headline that's just meant to grab attention, not give accurate information.
Exactly, and that's where those critical thinking skills are so important. The source says to watch out for information that just confirms our existing biases, or stuff that seems too good to be true. Cross-reference information, look for evidence from reputable sources, and use those fact-checking websites.
So be a skeptical consumer of information.
Precisely. And beyond misinformation, there's another challenge the source talks about: our own emotional biases.
Oh yeah, I think we all know about that one. Our emotions can definitely get the best of us, especially when we're talking about stuff we care about.
Absolutely. The source says we all have these emotional triggers, topics that make us react strongly. It tells us to be aware of those triggers and take a step back if we're getting too heated in a conversation.
So if I'm talking about, say, animal rights, and I feel myself getting worked up, it's a good idea to pause and come back when I'm calmer.
Exactly. That's a great strategy. The source also suggests things like slowing down your breathing, focusing on physical sensations, or even mentally reframing the situation to help you manage your emotional response.
I can see how those would be helpful to de-escalate things.
Absolutely. And once you've handled those emotional biases, there's still the challenge of communicating complex ideas in a way that people understand.
Yeah, sometimes I have all these thoughts.
Yeah.
But I just can't explain them clearly.
I hear ya. And the source gives us some tips for this. One of the key things is to simplify your language. Avoid jargon or technical terms that people might not get.
So don't try to sound like a research paper. Just talk normally so anyone can understand.
Exactly. The source also suggests using analogies, metaphors, and real-world examples to make your points more relatable and interesting.
I like that. It's like using storytelling to explain complicated stuff.
Precisely. And remember those visuals we talked about? Those can be super helpful for conveying complex info. A good chart or infographic can be way more effective than just a bunch of text.
So it's about being creative to bridge that gap between what we understand and how we explain it to others.
You got it. Now, with all these challenges in mind, the source doesn't just leave us hanging. It gives us some best practices to help us navigate this stuff and become better at expressing informed opinions.
Okay, give me the rundown. What are some key takeaways to help us put this into action?
One of the most important is to keep diversifying your sources.
All right, we talked about that. Going beyond our usual bubbles and getting info from different perspectives, even ones we might not agree with at first.
Exactly. Once you've found those diverse sources, the next step is to verify the info you're getting.
Don't just believe everything you read. Double-check the facts, look for evidence, and be careful with sources that use a lot of emotion or strong language.
Exactly. And when you're having conversations, practice active listening.
Right. Actually try to understand the other person's view, even if we disagree. Listen to learn, not just to respond.
Well said. And since the world is constantly changing, staying updated is key.
Don't rely on old info. Stay current on the issues you care about.
Exactly. And finally, one of the most important best practices is transparency.
Okay, what does that mean?
Transparency means clearly stating your sources so people can check them out. It also means acknowledging your own biases and being open to feedback, even criticism.
So be honest about where you're coming from and admit that you don't know everything.
Precisely. And above all, be respectful.
All right, even when talking about tough issues. We got to remember, we're all human.
Well said. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. From different news sources to AI tools, we've explored ways to form, express, and engage with informed opinions. And we've also talked about the challenges, like information overload, misinformation, emotional bias, and how to deal with them.
So listeners, I hope you're feeling ready to go out there and speak your mind.
Do your research, stay curious, be respectful, and don't be afraid to use those digital tools.
And that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Not at all. The source talks about tools that anyone can use. Even if you're not a tech person, think of it as like a power-up for your informed opinion toolkit. One of the first tools it mentions is visualization software, like programs like Canva or even just those drawing tools in Google Docs. They can help you make charts, graphs, or even mind maps to show your ideas visually. Remember that emissions policy we were talking about? Imagine making a simple infographic. That shows how much pollution levels could go down over time because of the policy. That visual impact can be really powerful.
Okay, I see how that could be useful. A picture's worth 1,000 words or whatever. But what about those AI tools you mentioned? That sounds kind of futuristic to me.
It does sound like that, but they're actually becoming pretty easy to use. For example, let's say you're trying to understand how the public feels about this emissions policy. There are AI tools that do sentiment analysis. They can scan social media news articles, online forums, and tell you the overall sentiment, positive, negative, or neutral. It's like having a finger on the pulse of what people are thinking.
Whoa. That's wild. So instead of spending hours reading through comments and stuff, I can just use a tool to tell me what the general mood is.
Exactly. It can save you so much time and give you valuable insights. And there's more. Remember information overload? Well, AI can help with that too. There are summarization tools that use natural language processing, or NLP, to basically condense those long reports or articles into key points, highlighting the most important stuff.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I get so lost in those long reports sometimes.
I know what you mean. And that's where these tools can be a lifesaver. They help you get the gist of a complicated document without having to read every single word.
So AI can help with research analysis and even public opinion. Is there anything it can't do?
Well, it's not magic, but it can definitely make us better at expressing informed opinions. One more tool I want to mention is grammar and style checkers. Maybe not exactly AI-powered, but platforms like Grammarly are super helpful. They make sure your writing is clear, concise, and error-free.
That's a good one. Sometimes I focus so much on what I'm writing that I miss typos and stuff.
Absolutely. And some of these tools do even more than just grammar and spelling. They give suggestions to improve your sentences, make things clearer, and even adjust the tone. So you sound persuasive, but not too emotional or biased.
Feels like we have a whole bunch of digital tools now.
We do. The main takeaway is that technology can really help us express informed opinions. It's not about replacing our thinking, but about making us better and making the whole process more efficient and effective.
I'm really starting to see how useful these tools are.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember, expressing informed opinions isn't about reaching some final point or having all the answers. It's a journey of learning, engaging, and evolving.
Yeah, it's about being curious, open-minded, and willing to question our own assumptions.
Exactly. And realizing that our opinions can change as we learn more, see different perspectives and think about our experiences.
That's a good point. We covered a lot in this deep dive. From news sources to AI tools, we explored a lot of ways to form, express, and engage with informed opinions.
And we talked about the challenges too, like information overload, misinformation, and emotional bias, and how to handle them.
So listeners, I hope you feel ready to go out there and share your thoughts.
Remember to do your research, stay curious, be respectful, and use those tools to make a difference.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.